Somewhere in America tonight, a filing cabinet sits in an evidence locker, still holding photographs that a judge once called some of the most disturbing his court had ever seen. They were found behind a false wall in a $77 million mansion in the heart of Manhattan. The man who put them there is dead. The woman who helped him is in federal prison, and more than 2 decades after it began, no one, not the FBI, not the Department of Justice, not the survivors who lived through it, can say with certainty that the truth has ever fully come out. This is the story of how one man built an empire on the silence of the powerful, and how, even in his death, that silence has never completely broken. The night is October 3rd, 2005, just after 11 p.m. In the quiet oceanfront town of Palm Beach, Florida, a police cruiser sits motionless outside a sprawling mansion on El Brio Way, its headlights cutting through the humid dark, illuminating hedges trimmed into perfect right angles. Inside that mansion, behind wrought iron gates and manicured lawns that cost more than most Americans would earn in a lifetime, a 14-year-old girl has just told her mother something no parent should ever have to hear. Within hours, that conversation reaches the Palm Beach Police Department, and a detective named Joe Reckery opens a file that will, over the next 2 decades, unravel one of the most disturbing conspiracies in modern American history. The house belongs to a man named Jeffrey Epstein, a financier so private that even his neighbors could not say exactly what he did for a living, only that his wealth seemed limitless, and his guest list seemed to include senators, scientists, royalty, and titans of industry. What detectives find as they begin knocking on doors is not a singular crime, but a system. A pipeline. Young girls, some as young as 14, recruited by other young girls, paid in cash to visit a mansion where they were told they would be giving massages. The deeper the police dig, the more names surface, the more addresses connect, and the more they begin to realize that what they are looking at is not an isolated predator, but an operation. Engineered with the same precision Epstein once used to build hedge funds and manage the fortunes of billionaires. By 2006, Palm Beach investigators have identified dozens of potential victims, and they push for the harshest possible charges, hoping to see Epstein face life in federal prison. But somewhere between the police station and the courtroom, something shifts. In the summer of 2008, in a nondescript federal building in Miami, Florida, a deal is quietly struck. The man who should have faced a 53-count federal indictment, a man the FBI believed had abused more than 3 dozen minors, is instead allowed to plead guilty to 2 state prostitution charges. The agreement, negotiated under United States Attorney Alexander Acosta, grants Epstein something almost unheard of, a non-prosecution agreement that shields not only him, but any unnamed co-conspirators from future federal charges. He serves 13 months in the Palm Beach County Jail, but even that sentence is a mirage. Records later obtained by journalists reveal that Epstein was allowed to leave the facility for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, driven by his own private driver to an office he maintained downtown, a work-release arrangement so unusual that it appears almost nowhere else in the history of American sex offender sentencing. When he walks free in 2009, Jeffrey Epstein does not disappear into obscurity. He returns to his estates, to his private Boeing 727, nicknamed by some as the Lolita Express, and to his island in the United States Virgin Islands, a 40-acre stretch of land called Little St. James, where he continues to entertain a circle of the powerful and the influential, seemingly untouched by the conviction that should have ended his access to that world entirely. For nearly a decade, the machinery of justice stays quiet, but a woman named Virginia Giuffre refuses to let the story die. She had been recruited as a teenager while working at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in Palm Beach, and she becomes one of the most persistent public voices demanding accountability, filing lawsuits, giving interviews, and naming names in sworn depositions. Investigative journalists begin circling back to the case as well, most notably Julie K. Brown of the Miami Herald, who in November of 2018 publishes a searing multi-part investigation titled Perversion of Justice. Brown tracks down more than 60 of Epstein's victims and lays bare, in exhaustive detail, exactly how the 2008 plea deal was constructed and who benefited from its secrecy. The public outcry is immediate and furious. Within months, Alexander Acosta, now serving as United States Secretary of Labor under President Donald Trump, resigns from his cabinet position under mounting pressure. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York reopen the case, and on July 6, 2019, as Jeffrey Epstein's private plane touches down at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, FBI agents are waiting on the tarmac. He is arrested on federal charges of sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy, and this time, there will be no quiet deal. Investigators search his Manhattan townhouse on East 71st Street, a 9-story mansion valued at over $77 million. And inside, they discover a chilling archive. Filing cabinets filled with nude photographs of young women and girls, some hidden behind false walls. Evidence that suggests a level of premeditation and control that goes far beyond opportunity into the architecture of a deliberate criminal enterprise. Epstein is denied bail. A judge rules him a flight risk and a danger to the community, and he is remanded to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan, one of the most secure federal facilities in the country. On August 9, 2019, guards find him unresponsive in his cell in an apparent suicide attempt so serious it leaves him hospitalized. And yet, astonishingly, he is returned to the same unit under standard observation rather than the suicide watch protocol that should have followed such an incident. 19 days later, in the early hours of August 10, 2019, correctional officers find Jeffrey Epstein dead in his cell, hanging from a bedsheet tied to the top bunk. The 2 guards assigned to monitor him that night had, according to later investigations, falsified their logs, claiming to have checked on him every 30 minutes, when in fact they had not moved from their desks for hours, reportedly asleep or distracted, browsing the internet instead. The official ruling from the New York City Medical Examiner is suicide, but the death ignites a firestorm of public suspicion that has never fully faded, fueled by the sheer number of powerful individuals who had reason to fear what Epstein might reveal if his case had gone to trial. Whether the truth is as simple as institutional negligence colliding with a broken man facing life in prison, or something far more calculated, the world will likely never know for certain. Because the one person who held the answers was silenced permanently before he could testify. But Epstein's death does not end the investigation, because he was never the only architect of this operation. Ghislaine Maxwell, the daughter of disgraced British media mogul Robert Maxwell, had been Epstein's closest confidante for over 2 decades, and prosecutors allege she was not merely present, but instrumental, personally recruiting and grooming underage girls, normalizing the abuse, and in some cases participating directly. For nearly a year after Epstein's death, Maxwell remains a ghost, reportedly hiding in a secluded property in New Hampshire, until FBI agents track her down and arrest her on July 2, 2020. Her trial begins in November of 2021 in a federal courtroom in Manhattan, and over the course of several weeks, 4 women take the stand and describe, methodically and painfully, how Maxwell had built trust with them as teenagers, only to lead them into rooms where Epstein would be waiting. On December 29, 2021, a jury finds Ghislaine Maxwell guilty on 5 of 6 counts, including sex trafficking of a minor. In June of 2022, she is sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, a moment that survivors and investigators alike view as the first true measure of justice the case has ever delivered, even as questions continue to swirl around who else may have known, participated, or looked away. The investigation into how Jeffrey Epstein escaped serious punishment in 2008 did not end with public outrage alone. In November of 2020, the Department of Justice's Office of Professional Responsibility released a scathing internal report, the product of a multi-year review into the conduct of prosecutors who negotiated the original non-prosecution agreement. The report concluded that the decision-making process had been, in its own words, poor judgment, though it stopped short of recommending criminal charges against any of the attorneys involved, including Alexander Acosta. For the victims who had waited over a decade for accountability, the finding felt like a hollow verdict, an acknowledgement of failure with no consequence attached to it. Palm Beach Police Chief Michael Reiter, who had led the original 2005 investigation and pushed for federal charges, would later describe watching his department's exhaustive case file, built on hundreds of hours of surveillance and dozens of victim interviews, reduced to what he called a mockery of the justice system. Reiter had gone so far as to send his findings directly to the FBI's Miami field office, when he lost faith that state prosecutors would pursue the case seriously. a decision that ultimately triggered the federal investigation that produced the 53-count indictment Epstein never had to answer for. The financial infrastructure that allowed Epstein's operation to function for so long also came under intense scrutiny in the years following his death. Court filings revealed that J.P. Morgan Chase had continued banking Epstein for years after his 2008 conviction, processing large cash withdrawals that internal compliance officers had flagged as suspicious. Patterns investigators would later argue were consistent with payments made to recruit and silence victims. In 2023, J.P. Morgan agreed to pay $290 million to settle a class action lawsuit brought by Epstein's victims, followed by a separate settlement with the United States Virgin Islands, which had filed its own suit alleging the bank enabled trafficking on Epstein's island. Deutsche Bank, which took Epstein on as a client shortly after J.P. Morgan severed ties with him in 2013, agreed to pay $75 million in a similar settlement after regulators found the bank had failed to adequately monitor transactions despite Epstein's well-documented criminal history. These settlements marked the first time institutions beyond Epstein and Maxwell themselves faced direct financial consequences, and they exposed an uncomfortable truth that an entire ecosystem of professionals, bankers, accountants, and money managers had either looked away or actively facilitated the movement of funds that sustained his operation for years. Academic institutions found themselves entangled as well. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology faced intense public backlash after internal emails revealed that senior administrators, including the director of its media lab, had continued accepting donations from Epstein years after his conviction, in some cases deliberately concealing the source of the funds by labeling them as anonymous. The scandal led to the resignation of Media Lab director Joy Ito in 2019 and prompted an independent investigation into how deeply the university's relationships with Epstein had run, with the final report revealing that Epstein had donated or helped direct more than $7 million to MIT researchers over nearly 2 decades, long after his predatory history was public record. Harvard University faced similar questions over donations, and Epstein's continued access to campus facilities even after his 2008 conviction, prompting its own internal review. For survivors watching these institutional reckonings unfold, each new revelation reinforced the same central theme of the entire case, that Epstein's wealth had purchased not just silence, but a kind of institutional shelter extended to him by people and organizations who had every reason to know better. In January of 2024, a federal judge ordered the unsealing of court documents from a 2015 defamation lawsuit filed by Virginia Giuffre, releasing thousands of pages that named more than 150 individuals connected in some way to Epstein, a list that included business leaders, academics, and public figures. Though the documents themselves made clear that being named was not evidence of wrongdoing, and many of those mentioned appeared only in passing, in flight logs, or as acquaintances with no allegations of misconduct attached to their names. Journalists spent weeks combing through the material, and while the unsealing produced no new criminal charges, it reignited public debate over how many people in Epstein's orbit had suspected, witnessed, or simply chosen not to ask questions about what was happening behind the walls of his estates. Congress, too, has continued to press for answers, with members of the House Oversight Committee requesting the full release of the Department of Justice's investigative files, a request that as of this recording remains only partially fulfilled, with officials citing ongoing victim privacy concerns and sealed grand jury material as reasons for continued redactions. In the years since, the shadow of Jeffrey Epstein's network has continued to stretch across American public life, resurfacing in flight logs, in unsealed court documents, in the so-called Black Book that listed hundreds of contacts spanning finance, politics, science, and royalty. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, would ultimately settle a civil lawsuit brought by Virginia Giuffre and step back from public royal duties entirely, though he has always denied any wrongdoing. What makes the Epstein case so uniquely unsettling within the landscape of American criminal history is not simply the scale of the abuse, but the sheer number of institutions, law enforcement agencies, financial giants, and elite universities that intersected with it and, in one form or another, failed to stop it. Each individual failure, a lenient plea deal, an unmonitored bank account, a quietly accepted donation, might on its own seem like ordinary institutional negligence. But stacked together across 2 decades, they form the outline of something far more troubling, a system that was never truly broken, but simply worked exactly as it was designed to for a man who understood, better than almost anyone, how to convert wealth into invisibility. Jeffrey Epstein has been dead since 2019. Ghislaine Maxwell remains behind bars. But the full architecture of who else enabled this operation, who profited from looking away, and how many more victims were never counted, remains, even now, one of the most incomplete chapters in the modern American pursuit of justice.